Yeah, and I'm very happy to introduce Sasha Shestakova, decolonial researcher from Russia. Right now, Sasha is based in Bochum and is writing a PhD there, and also involved in a lot of decolonial initiatives which are happening right now. We will have today a lecture, and then part where you will be able to ask questions and also maybe make comments. And I will just pass it to Sasha.
Yeah. Thank you so much, and thank you guys for organizing this, and thank you so much for inviting me. And before I start my lecture, I would like to start with a positionality statement. So I am a Russian person, and I see my work as a decolonial researcher is to first of all discuss the ways in which Russian colonialism operates, and second of all, support and highlight the existing decolonial movements. And today I will be using as a starting point the work by Keto Gorgadze and Ptuška, which addresses Russian nuclear colonialism. And so the structure of my today's lecture is informed by the artwork, and it will consist of three parts: epistemic inequality, and they call them epistemic inequality, clashing temporalities, and resistance. And so I will be speaking for, I suppose, around 40 minutes, maybe an hour. And so I will start by discussing the ways how the condition that is discussed in the artwork, which combines the violence towards bodies and the violence towards the land, how this condition came about, and I will be doing that by looking at the Soviet visual culture, specifically from the position of history of Russian colonialism. And second of all, I will be discussing Russian colonial project as both spatial and a temporal one. And then I will be speaking about one case of anti-colonial resistance, and yeah, I will speak about it more during the lecture. And so, as a starting point, I would like to start from this, from the project of distribution of nuclear reactors to the Soviet republics, and this process was happening in the 1960s. And so what is important about this, and what is important about this project of distribution, is that it was quite centralized, and the equipment and the accelerators and all of the things that constituted a nuclear reactor, they came from Moscow and from St. Petersburg, so they were designed there, and then they were distributed across Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and several other places. And what makes this particularly interesting is that the existence of a nuclear reactor sustains the dependency from Russia, because, for instance, in Uzbekistan, Russia still claims to be providing so-called innovative fuel. And so another thing is, for example, in Kazakhstan, Russia's presence was needed to disassemble the nuclear reactor which was put there in the Soviet time. And so, as Mark Sienkiewicz and Anna Engelhardt explained, the nuclear power plants threaten the Astrovets nuclear power plant that is currently that was constructed in Belarus, threatens the sovereignty of Belarus, which no longer supported by borders, but is being dismantled from within. It entails such consequences as the separation of Belarus from its infrastructure and violation of territorial integrity. Similarly, Kazakh scientist Asad Zabayev explains that Russian-developed nuclear reactor requires fuel also produced by Russia, which opens infinite possibilities for long-term control. And as I said, this existence of such infrastructure provides this possibility of ongoing Russian control. And to explain what was happening, I have a scheme which combines the long-term violence and epistemic inequality. And I understand that, and I think the best way to explain epistemic inequality would be through a TikTok sound, which goes the following way: were you silent or were you silenced? So epistemic inequality is a condition where the concerns of some people are not heard and are not considered as valid. And it is particularly important both in relation to Keto Gorgadze and Ptuška's work, as well as the ongoing condition of the presence of nuclear reactors. That is, the people who resist Russian colonial violence are not seen as, are not heard in the equal terms. And and to understand this condition, I'd like to go to the history of Soviet nationalist politics, and I'd like to show the following picture. And it is those figures are, and I think what is also, I want to first return to nuclear reactor and to quote, to read out this quote, and it goes as follows: the Leninist national politics of the Communist Party of the USSR directed towards rising the economy and culture of all nations and peoples in the USSR and to the flowering of science and all the fraternal republics. And this is a very particular quote because it was written by a Soviet nuclear scientist when he was explaining why national republics actually need those reactors. So Russians were considered as someone who will bring science and knowledge to the so-called backward republics. So, and through this infrastructure, the backwardness was very much crafted and produced. But what I think very important here is this idea of Leninist national politics and this idea of self-determination, because to understand how self-determination was understood by the Soviet state, and also to understand how what was meant by self-determination by the 1960s, we have to go back to the 1930s when this nation's right to self-determination was transformed into the so-called friendship of the people. And also it is important to understand that those scientists speaking about it, they were seeing those images. For instance, if they were in Moscow, if they were working in Moscow, they would go down in the metro and see those sculptures. And those sculptures are still present in Thyroxia metro station in Moscow. And it was decorated by sculptor Natalia Danko in the 1930s. And it was supposed to represent different peoples who were wearing so-called traditional clothes and performing the so-called traditional dance. And one important thing is that the form of the sculpture, like the very materiality of the sculpture, it was Danko took it from the sculptures which were produced before the Soviet Union in the Lomonosov factory, and those sculptures were supposed to represent different peoples who live in Russia. And what makes it particularly interesting is that even though Russian Soviet state at that time claimed that it was very different from the Russian Empire, that it actually was developing this idea of friendship and of unity of the people. In fact, in its visual culture, it reproduced these very persistent images which were made in the Russian Empire. And I'm showing this slide, this sculpture of a conchidal man from the 19th century. And also, it also exemplifies that another thing is that for, I think since the 1930s, for the Soviet state, the only way in which peoples who were not Russians could be represented and shown were wearing national costumes and performing a traditional dance, which very soon became part of this idea of unity of the people. And also I have to kind of mention this, and I will quote Stalin here to show how this narrative of friendship of the people was produced. And I quote, and this is, it was from a speech which was made in 1935, so this is the moment where friendship of the people becomes, a thing. The distrust between peoples of the USSR has been replaced with a complete mutual trust. The friendship between the peoples of the USSR is growing and strengthening. That is the most valuable of all the Bolshevik nationalities policy has produced. So what is done in this speech is this connection is drawn between this idea of the right to self-determination, which was used by Lenin in one of his talking points. And it is particularly interesting because this idea of the nation's right to self-determination is kind of what allowed the Soviet state to become the way we kind of know to look the way it looked like, because it provided this support, the support from the local socialists and communists who kind of believed that nation's right to self-determination was possible, but already by this moment Stalin's speech is made, it has become quite obvious that no nation's right to self-determination would be possible, and it would be completely absorbed and absorbed into the friendship of the people. And another important thing that happens as the nation's right, as the friendship of the people is formed, is the centrality, is the production of the centrality of Russian in this friendship of the people. And it is also produced visually. It is produced in literature and culture, but also visually. And in visually, it is very, very evident. And I'm showing these two paintings. One is as early as 1923, and another one is by Alexander Dyneka, and it was quite a massive wall painting. And it is from the 1930s, I think one important thing to understand is the way how these images were distributed, and they were distributed through all union exhibitions. So they were shown and they were produced specifically to quote Ilya Abakayeva-Tizenhausen, who is a Kazakh researcher of art and visual culture. It was, they were supposed to depict the official version of so-called necessary happiness and this necessary unity, and the Russians were supposed to be produced as these leading figures, as the best among the equals, who would in the 1930s 1930s, they would be bringing revolution. They would be bringing all sorts of progress. And as Soviet propaganda put it, they were in the center of the mighty family of the peoples of the USSR, and they were standing in the great. They were in the center of the mighty family of the peoples of the USSR stands the great Russian people, patiently loved by all the peoples of the USSR, the first among equals. So they not only, so these images not only produce this centrality of Russians, they also created this idea of mutual love, support, and respect, and this kind of like insistence on peace and on the brotherhood. And why it is important now? It is important now because and like after the World War II, so in 1954, so it's already like after Stalin's death, this fountain was finished, and it is located in the people who have been in Moscow might have seen this. It is located also in the exhibition of all the successes of all union successes exhibition, and as people were entering it, they could see it. And an important thing is that in the front, so first figure, so it's a figure of really like golden women, which represent several republics. And the first figure they see is, of course, the Russian one. And also this fountain very vividly exemplifies the hierarchy of nationalities that was produced at that point, because the first ones that visitors to the National Exhibition saw were the white and Slavic ones. And then they would go around and just see the republics which were not white and not Slavic. And another interesting thing about this fountain is that it was reconstructed in 2019, and I have found a clip of how the process of reconstruction was portrayed by the Russian state, and how this process of reconstruction was used as a part of the more contemporary Russian propaganda.
I also know the funny fact, one artist, sculptor, if you want I can also say his name, he, not now, like before the war, he used a lot of time, like for years, as an atelier building in this, in this park. And he paid for his atelier. He made small sculptures for
tourists.
For tourists, not for tourists, for present to politics from within director.
Yeah, this very much contribute. But first of all, it kind of sadly makes sense because also this image is very much embedded in the way Russia keeps portraying itself as this idea of like unity of the nations and this production of brotherhood and peace. And another thing that was happening after the World War II is that this image of the unity of the nations was exported and Russia was basically using this idea of the friendship of the people as a way of including itself and producing this. But also, interestingly enough, Russia kind of saw itself as the most important one and still like leading other nations towards socialist future and wherever direction. So interestingly enough, Russia kind of expanded its nationalities, politics, and friendship of the people, and this kind of like this leadership from colonial occupation and settler colonialism of the nations which were colonized before that by the Russian Empire. It started to expand itself towards different parts of the world. So another thing that was happening after the World War II, and it is also a show, and it kind of allows me to see Russian colonialism as both spatial and temporal project, because it's after the 1953 when the thaw began and when the cult of the cult of the leadership of Stalin was denounced. Even though it was denounced, the large-scale infrastructural construction, as well as this idea of Russianness, which is situated in the center of Russian colonial imagination, persisted. But from this leadership in front of all of the nations, it moved towards this leadership in science. And so, as this images very vividly show, this is like a set of visual imagery about science and also peaceful atom and as well as Sputnik and as well as like this primarily image of scientists as someone who will bring the Soviet Union to the prosperity. It was very much given to Russians. And I think it's also kind of for those who were here during the previous discussion, it kind of connects to this question by the person named Alexander, who asked the members of the audience or the members of the panel that why would they only like be able to speak Russian if they want to study physics or whatever. So this is very much the reason for why this is happening, because historically this role of Russians was established. So, and this also shows that. So basically, not only the colonial space was occupied, also the time and the future at that point was stolen. And to continue this, and this is where I switch to the conversation about temporality and time. And and I would like to show you the artwork by Vladislav Kalichuk called Atom. And on the left on the color picture is the one which was reconstructed in 2018, and it was reconstructed by Garage Museum of Contemporary Art. And the support to this project was given by a corporation named Rosatom. And Rosatom is a Russian nuclear corporation which currently actively participates in the infrastructure dismantling of borders, which I discussed in the beginning of the lecture, but also it is Rosatom workers in the Russia-occupied of Chernobyl nuclear power station. They were participating in what Svetlana Matviyenko has termed as nuclear terrorism. That is the creation of the constant nuclear threat. And the reconstruction of this work in 2018 provides a really great example of the persistence of Russian nuclear imaginaries. But originally, this work was commissioned by the Curated Institute of the Nuclear Energy, and it was supposed to represent the idea of a peaceful atom. As art historian Alexander Novazhonov has observed, the function of the artwork was to represent the idea of the so-called peaceful scientific progress, which was one of the main ideas in front of the hopes for the scientific progress of that time. And it was a ball made of tiny tubes composed around a metal center. The ball was hung on a mast and it felt like it's hovering over the ground. The surrounding street lamps were equipped with colorful filters, and as the ball was turning around, its color changed from the color of the lights. And Kalichuk was actually one of the members of the group called Движение movement, and it was established in 1962, so around pretty much the same time as nuclear reactors are distributed across different republics, and the science becomes this very important idea for the Soviet state. And their manifesto goes as follows: let us expand the horizons. Let people see tomorrow. Let us learn the new language of souls. We have planted the seed today. We will grow the flowering tree tomorrow. And in their works, Движение looked back at these futuristic impulses of the Russian avant-garde, of the so-called Russian avant-garde of the early 20th century. And the documentation that show it's called towards the synthesis of art. This shows spiral objects which were lit by the colorful lights, and they were like perpetually moving. And as one of the group members, Lev Nusberg, they put it. The function of art was the waking up of the human imagination, and this, they wanted to create new forms, ornaments, and environments. And they very much relied on this legacy of the 20th century avant-garde, and they described, importantly, themselves as inventors, whose task was to create new forms and alter human perception. And as Polish art historian Indrich Holubecki has observed, the kinetic artist's engagement with the futuristic vision of the Russian avant-garde was informed by the invention and creation of the new forms in the here and now. And also their enthusiasm was very much coupled with collaborations with scientific institutions which were working in the Soviet state. So it was, for them, it was not a matter of like the so-called rhetorical camouflage. Science, for them, science offered, and I quote here, novel materials for producing a new order of synthetic art. And their commission included Curated Institute of Atomic Energy, the Institute of High Temperature in Moscow, and also important to understand that for artists at that time, having official commissions was rather, and like having a job was a necessity, because otherwise they would be in prison for the so-called parasitism. But for Движение, the affiliation of the scientific institution and collaboration with scientists provided them with resources, and also it was part of their artistic project, because as Lev Nusberg, one of the group members, and one of the key group members explained, it was a way of straightening their positions and receiving the recognition which would allow the group to do its work. And so this affiliation with Kurchatov Institute, for example, started with the acquaintance with a person called Nikolai Kuznetsov, and he worked at the Kurchatov Institute as an engineer, and so he had the skills and access to the materials so that he could use to develop and program the works for Движение group. And this, actually, the documentation I'm showing as that it's an exhibition made in the House of Culture of Kurchatov Institute, and after that, Klichuk was commissioned to produce the atom, which was also like installed right in front of the institute. And another commission of the group included the decoration of the center of Leningrad St. Petersburg on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of October Revolution. The large scale, there is this large scale sculpture physics, and it represented the atomic dreams of the solid state. Similar to Klichuk works, the physics sculpture alluded to the molecular form of an atom and flickered night with different colors, and it was coupled with other sculptures that are chemistry, and which repeated the form of a chemical lattice molecule. And there was also this projection of Lenin on the train station. And so, put in the center of the Leningrad on the occasion of nationwide celebrations, the sculptures were the symbols of what the solid state saw as a main achievement, and that is this idea of the peaceful science. Another thing that is, I think, quite interesting about this group is the fact that they very much collaborated both locally and internationally, so they not only received recognition within the Soviet state, they also were kind of famous abroad. They participated in two documentas, Documenta 4 and Documenta 6, and they also participated in several exhibitions abroad. And so this example I'm showing is the evidence that they were in conversation with Harald Zeman, who was a German curator, and this is very interesting because they collaborated because of the shared interest to the avant-garde, and this was found. This is the image from Zeman collection, and it is part of the portfolio that the Движение provided him. And so this, and importantly enough, they when they were abroad, they described themselves as the unofficial artists and as the artists who were under persecution and whatever. But at the same time, they have had these official commissions, and they were very enthusiastic about this idea of peaceful science and peaceful atom. And they were also this, they very, and their enthusiasm was connected with the usage of the methods of the Russian avant-garde, and this is the part of the lecture where I would like to go and discuss what the idea of a peaceful atom means. And I would like to go into this idea of peaceful nuclear explosions. And this peaceful, as you can see very vividly on the map, first of all, they took place in the parts of the USSR which were colonized by Russia. They took place in Kazakh USSR, in Yakut USSR, in Bashkir USSR. And the idea, the rationale behind the peaceful explosions can be summarized as the idea of correcting the mistakes of nature. And the idea of turning the river, of turning the rivers backwards, quite literally, of reaching the biggest depth of the ground, and it was very much connected with this idea of progressive movement, which, as we have noticed, very much informed the visual culture of this time. For example, the Soviet nuclear oil project had the goal of forcing the depth to give up their riches through nuclear explosions, which allowed the oil to kind of get out. And another project is called the turning of the rivers. And so the Russian state, well, the Soviet state quite literally wanted to turn the rivers backwards and direct several rivers towards the Caspian Sea. And but the consequences of that nuclear explosions can be seen here. And the picture on the right shows the explosion in Chusovskaya village, and it is so someone, a witness, took a picture of which was supposed to be a peaceful explosion. Which in fact ended with a black rain and contamination of multiple bodies. And in Chagan, the crater was filled with water, and to this day, it's still present, and the water is still contaminated. And as Russian biologist Alexei Yablokov points out, the absence of data about the scale of nuclear, the still absence of data about the scale of the nuclear contamination in the area surrounding the explosion site does not mean the absence of consequences. Instead, the contamination can intensify with time, spanning larger area. He names cancer as one of the consequences of nuclear contamination of soil and groundwaters, which can span several generations. In Yakutia, the ground explosions have left residues in the bodies of people and the landscape. The residues from the underground explosions in Sakha include a still contaminated lake, which was created instead of a dam and still contains radiation, and the destroyed forest contaminated by nuclear rain after the underground explosion. So the linear time produced by Russian visual culture and Russian propaganda shatters. On the one hand, it becomes this micro-temporalities of explosion. On the other hand, it leaves its traces in the bodies of multiple people, and it leaves its traces both in the bodies and in the soil and water. Even after the dissolution of the USSR, the traces keep persisting. And I will shortly talk about one resistance, one of the forms of resistance offered to Russian nuclear colonialism. And it is, I will try to turn on the video. This video is from the end of the 1980s, and it was a protest against the construction of the atomic station in Thhyroxia, and and it was connected and it was emerging at the same time, and it was part of the national liberation movement. For example, at the same time this process was forming, the person who started developing the ideas of Tatar national liberation in the early 20th century, we say Sultan Khalif, was rehabilitated and came to be recognized again. And this state, and as a result of the ongoing process of this resistance, the station was not built. And I think this exemplifies this project of reclamation of the future, and it is both reclamation of space and reclamation of time, and as it allowed to envision the future not occupied by the Russian state. Yet, Russian colonial violence kind of kept persisting, and so the Russian state in 2017 decided to build the nuclear station again, but the protest also continued, and one of the things that people who protested say they refer to Tatar nuclear station as the poisonous grave of Tatar people, and they proposed also an alternative project that would include the wind energy, and they demanding the temporal sovereignty as their vision of the future did not align with the ideas imposed by the Russian state. They persisted despite the continuing attempts of the Russian state to dismantle it. Thank you very much, and thank you for your patience. Questions?
Yeah, I will pass this one.
No one else? Maybe I have a question. I don't know, it's maybe also something which I don't really know about, but I know that for maybe Western art and academia, like the kind of space race and the art created around space and the philosophy is maybe something more inspiring and I don't know, fascinating than something which is perceived critically, and maybe you know like examples or when it was problematic, but also examples maybe when this was challenged and
first of all, thank you for your question, and of course I kind of see you hinting towards Russian Cosmism. So yes, of course, this idea of the space race and this idea that that the occupation of space, basically, and of the outer space is a part of the progress, is rooted in very similar ideas. But I will be honest, I haven't done extensive research on the critiques of that. I would say that I would suppose that in Kazakhstan there would be resistance, and recently Kazakhstan took the Russian previously Soviet-constructed space launching station. They kind of reclaimed it from the Soviet Union, but I would suppose that I would direct you to also to do research done by Christine Bichel and also to Mahira Sverkolova, who have both done some research on the resistance and also to the reclamation of these Soviet ideas of outer space and occupation of the outer space.
questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's okay with that.
It's better for the recording because that will be heard also because for the mic.
Okay, thank you. Can you maybe talk a bit more about this returning project, or in general about this, I don't know, shaping the landscapes?
Yes,
maybe
yes,
for
of course. Yeah, I think
reasons or something?
Yeah, I think so. I think the reasons behind that this project luckily didn't succeed. But the reasons behind it was this like idea of Russia as of the Soviet Union as someone who controls everything, coming to its the highest point. And this like idea that we can like do whatever we want, and we can turn the rivers, we can shape the landscape, and it was justified by the needs of the economy, of the socialist economy, and by justifying this by the needs of socialist economy, they kind of destroyed the lands and people's bodies, I would say. Did I answer your question?
Yes. Thank you.
First of all, thank you so much for the lecture. It was very interesting to listen to. Obviously, this is research still happening, but I was wondering if you have any reading recommendations for somebody wanting to look a bit further into it. You probably have 100, but maybe like one.
No,
or two.
I can like go to the bibliography of the lecture.
Yes.
But I would recommend the text, of course, like the work of Svetlana Matvienko, and I would also recommend the work of nGbK, whom I have quoted, on the Russian colonial infrastructures. I have already mentioned Mahira Syrkulova, I have mentioned Christine Bechel. I would also recommend the work by Bethanien, and I will also recommend you to go back to the exhibition and look at the video by Keto Gorgadze. And also, as for like the art history readings, I would really recommend this book by Epistemic, because it's a very interesting book about the way the way visual culture operated. It's a bit of like random throwing of recommendations that you.
I will start with the bibliography. Thank you so much.
Yeah. But it's very, I would also say that this is a very specific bibliography, and it includes some of, I would say some quite problematic sources, because you never know where you find stuff for your research. So.
And Svetlana Matvienko will be giving also a lecture on 14th of May, connected to also the side program of the exhibition. So it will be probably not here, so you can follow maybe on social media of Feminist Translocalities. We will announce it.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your lecture. I'm just wondering, you showed this Vladimir Kolychuk atom sculpture back from 60s, right? And it's contemporary reappropriation by Rosatom, right? As I understand, this group, like Kinetic Group, was oppositional, like dissident group to Soviet government.
Yeah, that's interesting, because on the one hand, they describe themselves as opposition. They describe themselves as unofficial artists, but they still did these commissions. And so I think it's also kind of asks the question of what it means, what like the idea of like unofficial art kind of means. And yeah, I'm going to have a detail here, and I won't go into heavy detail. But this, and also one important thing that it wasn't like appropriated per se. Kolychuk, I think it was the last work that was made while Kalichuk was alive. And it was made in connection with like the exhibition in Museum for Contemporary Art. So it wasn't very much like appropriated, it was very consciously sponsored. Yeah, but they were kind of in a position, but in a very particular and very weird way, I would say.
No, but that means that maybe contemporary Russian government appropriates even these groups that were unofficial and dissident during the Soviet Union, and they use it now like for the sake of.
I would say that not like I would say that both Russian and Soviet state used this particular art as a part of the propaganda, but also it also has to do with a mindset of particular artists who didn't see any problem with collaborating with Kurchatov Institute. So I would say that the responsibility for that is both on the Russian state, but also on these decisions that were made to collaborate with certain institutions. And it's also like kind of like a big conversation about about the complicity and how complicity operates. Shall we finish?
If there are no questions, we can finish and continue.
Yeah, I continue
informally. Yeah, thank you, Sasha. Thank you so much, everyone, for